Welcome back. We are in week 11 doing testing of web applications. Specifically, we are looking at testing dynamic web applications, client-side technologies, server-side technologies. I hope by now it is clear to you all what a client is and what a server is. User interface is on the client. The actual software is on the server. We are geographically separated. There could be several hundreds of clients accessing a website at the same time. And for testing for clients, because the technologies for developing web application scripts on the client side keep changing, we look at black box testing strategies. Typically, remember, inputs that the client provides to the web application sitting on the server are always HTML forms. They could be requests for through a HTML form or a HTML link. And such inputs have to be generated again by appropriate testing technique. In the last lecture, we saw one testing technique called bypass testing, where the goal was to generate test case values that violate the client-side validation constraints and send violated data to the server. Once the violated data is sent to the server, it is used to check how robust the server response is for that violated data. So that technique was called bypass testing. We saw 3 levels of bypass, one just purely based on values, one based on parameters where an input was a combination of values. The next was control flow level bypass testing, where you could send values that will alter the control flow in the application. Today, we're going to see the second blue highlighted thing, user session based data. So let me just go down by a few slides all the way down to user session based data so that we can get started with it. So just to motivate what user sessions are, let me give you a scenario of a typical use of a web application. Let's say a particular user is trying to do online shopping for a particular product. Let's say a user wants to buy a pair of running shoes. And the user searches for the pair of running shoes from a particular e-commerce site. And let's say he or she buys it or doesn't buy it. It doesn't matter. But the person searches for running shoes, looks at various pairs that are displayed on the e-commerce website and decides to buy or not buy it. So the next time the user opens the same browser, it could be several different browsers that we use, any of the browser. And let's say this time the user wants to read a piece of news. So he goes to the online edition of a newspaper, trying to see, look for some news and read a news article. If you typically see, what would happen is along the newspaper page, along with the information on the newspaper page about the newspaper article, you will find these advertisements which come as banners, which actually show the customer, the user, alternates for pairs of shoes. Because the person in the past on the same browser in the recent past has searched for a particular product. Browser or any other entity, maybe the e-commerce application, remembers the fact that this user searched for this particular product. And next time the user uses the same browser for completely different reason, like this time to read the news, the browser or some other entity there is going to replay that information about, here are better shoes, here are shoes on discount, this is what you looked for, based on your browsing history, here is what I have to show, and so on. So a lot of this kind of information is remembered by websites, by our browsers. And websites typically use a notion called cookies. Many times when we use websites, you'll get a pop-up which says you have to accept cookies, ignore cookies, or manage cookies, So cookies are basically some kind of session data that are used by browser. One is to store some information temporarily so that next time the browser loads, a lot of information that is locally stored can be retrieved. They are also used for purposes like advertisement, like in the case that I told you, right? Suppose a user had looked for a pair of running shoes, irrespective of whether it was bought or not. Next time the user uses the browser for the same reason, there are going to be advertisements that are loaded. The basis for loading these advertisements is the storage of session data. Some amount of information about a user session in the past is remembered and replayed for the user to be able to use targeted advertisements. So as far as testing is concerned, the same user session data acts as a rich source for us to generate test cases. So today, the testing approach for web applications that we're going to look at in this lecture is an approach based on user session data. We're going to use user session data to create test cases. We're going to see it at an algorithmic level, not really illustrated through examples. So the uses, these are actual sessions that the web application has been through. The control flow of the web applications has been through. So they form a rich source, a repository of information that can be used as test cases. So in some sense, it reduces the effort involved when test engineers are required to generate fresh test cases. And empirically, through studies that involve empirical data for software testing for web applications, it has been shown that in terms of effectiveness of finding faults, user session data-based techniques are the most effective. Because faults, web pages can behave in new ways if a new user uses it for the first time, and if a known user uses it, it behaves slightly differently. So web pages, new faults in web pages can be discovered by new users. Similarly, if you suddenly spike the number of users in a web page, faults can come. So these kinds of faults can be found very effectively by using user session database test cases. So what is this? We're going to see that. So I hope you can see this. I'll go full screen, sorry. Yeah, I hope you can see this diagram. It's a little small, but I hope you can read it. This tells you how a web application behaves, in particular, how the sequence diagram of a web application looks like. On the left-hand side, you have what we call the client browser, which is the user accessing, acting as a client and invoking the web application through a browser. That client request, this message, is sent to the web server, which is the next entity that you encounter. In response to that, the web server further requests for something from, let's say, an application server or a script server. And maybe the client requested for some, provided some form which requested for some data. So this application server, or it could directly be the web server, sends a SQL command to a data server, or basically a query. SQL is just a specific thing. It sends a query to a data server to request for some amount of data. The data server responds back this side, and then this is loaded back to the web server. Web server generates a HTML file and provides response back to the client. So this is one kind of flow. The other kind of flow could be directly from the application server without accessing the database server. Whatever it is, web server based on, remember we said there is a 3-tier or a 4-tier application. So these are the 3 tiers. Client is one, then web server, application server, database server is the 4th tier. And based on client requests, these various servers can be invoked through specific requests, and they provide responses. The request could just be a request for loading a new page, which is sending a URL, or it could be data sent through the form with a post or a GET request. Database server can get involved in several cases. Sometimes it need not get involved also. So this is how a web application behaves. If you look at the scenario or the sequence of events that happen in a web application. So now the same sequence of events, a particular request can go through one hop, another request can go through another hop. It could be from the same user, it could be from a different user, whatever it is. So those things are what we call user sessions. So let's first define what a user session is. So look at this last bullet here, last item here. We define a user session as beginning when a request from a new IP address reaches the server, and it ends when the user leaves the website, closes the browser, or the session times out on its own because of poor connectivity or no network connectivity, whatever it is. So a user session is basically a sequence of interactions that the client from a web browser sends to a web server right from the beginning when a request is sent from a fresh IP address. reaches the server, server provides a series of response by invoking possibly other server, and the user session ends when the user finally closes the website or the tab, or the session times out because of connectivity issues. So that's what is a user session. So based on the language that we use, scripting language that we use to generate our client-side scripts, it could be JavaScript, it could be ordinary HTML, it could be style sheets, it could be Java servlets, whatever it is. There are several different programming paradigms, scripting paradigms that are useful for client-side web applications. Almost all of them provide support to collect user session data. That's what modern day websites use. So we basically have several different ways of collecting client request information. And here is a sample of the various kinds of technologies that can be used. Don't worry if you don't know them. The point is not to know all these technologies, but the purpose of this slide is just to tell you that based on what is this scripting language that I write my client software in, it's a high chance, very high chance that the same scripting language provides features for me to log user session data. For example, if I use a simple Apache server, that can be used to log all the GET requests, which are basically the requests that are coming from the user session data, users for server responses. You can also write name value pairs by adding snippets of code to invoke a server-side logging script. If you use Java Servlet provides a feature called filters for you to recognize user session data. Even in plain HTML, you can incorporate cookies, which can be loaded in an interaction. Several different ways of logging user session data exists in the domain of web application technologies. So as testers, why not use that? So what we're going to teach in the user session database testing are basically three simple variants of a basic approach that involves user session data. One is to directly reuse, one is to save and replay a combination, the other is to save and replay a different combination. Along with that, you can use two different hybrid variants. What do we mean by two different hybrid variants? I'm not going to elaborate on this. What we mean is, once you have a user session data, and let's say you have your test requirement in mind, like for example, the test requirement could say, please provide inputs at boundary values. Remember, we saw boundary value analysis. So test requirement could be, please provide inputs at boundary values. So I could store the user session data, regenerate a particular form that provides inputs at boundary values. Like for example, suppose age is an input and the highest value of age that can be taken is 110. Then you provide age as 110, 111 and replay the user session data. So this is a hybrid variant because it uses a classical testing technique that we learned, like boundary value analysis combined with user session data. Another thing could be to use take user session data as paths, control flow paths that go through a web application, and then you could change some element of the path. So you could do path coverage like we saw in graph-based testing. So that's another variant that we call as a hybrid variant. So you could generate your own hybrid variants based on your test requirements. What we're going to see is how to you store and reuse user session data for these three techniques. So some notations before we go ahead. Let's assume that we have a set of M user sessions. Let's call it U1 to UM. UI consists of N requests. Each session UI consists of a sequence of N requests. So let's say they are R1, R2 and so on and Rn. Each request consists of either a URL or a form that has one or more values for name value against a name. The star is, remember what we saw in the context of syntax of regular expressions, the same clean a star. So assume that we have a set of user sessions, let's say M of them, and each user session consists of a series of N requests, let's say some N of them. Each request either asks for a simple URL or submits a set of values against a name, one or more set of values through a form. So that's what is a user session data. We say user session begins when a request comes from a new IP address, reaches the server, and it ends when the request leaves the website or the session times out. First technique of reusing user session data is directly reuse. So you store user session data based on previous patterns of users. They could be based on whatever they wanted to do, and you record them, that is store them, and replay them. Just transform it into a test case and write a script that would replay them. Basically, it's just nothing clever. It's just a simple idea. It's just a way of storing the user session and playing it back. We are not doing anything clever, anything intelligent here. So you might wonder, what is this about? Why should I store an already written user session and play it back? The basic idea here is that earlier it was a user session, an interaction of a user with a website. Now you are consciously using it as a test case. So suppose you want to do something like spike testing. By spike testing, you want to check, like for example, simultaneously if 1,000 users can access the website, and will the website's performance deteriorate? You want to test for something like this. Then you could use this direct saving and replay of these user sessions by just creating simple replicas of it. That will be a one use case for this. The next is combine data from different user sessions. If you look at the title of this slide, that's what it says. Combine data from different user sessions. So we assume the same thing. We assume that there are M user sessions. Each user session consists of a series of requests. Each request looks like this. So out of these M user session, pick an unused user session, let's say from that set. Let's call it UA. Now this UA is going to have a sequence of requests. Some R1, R2 and so on. Take the first I of them. First I of those requests from that unused user session UA. Now you stop at the ith request. So you're halfway through a user's interaction with a website. Now what you want to do is look for a different user session. Let's say UB. And the condition that UB should meet is that the first user session, you picked up the first I requests from them, right? And you stopped at the ith request, Ri. The user session UB should have the same request Ri. It might have other things preceding Ri, but that particular ith request Ri should match in the user session UB. So what you do is from the user session UA, you take the first 1 to I requests, follow it up with the ith request from the session UB, a different user session. So what you're doing is you're creating a new user session by taking one part, the first part from a first user session, second part from a second user session, such that at the joining place, at some I, they have a commonality. So this is a simple way of combining two different user sessions and generating test cases. So suppose you can't find another UB that has a matching Ri, then for the rest of it, you just treat it like a replay, random replay of some other use case. Is this clear? So combining different user sessions is basically a simple idea. Take a first unused user session, take some part of it such that the part at which this user session ends, you take another user session that has the same common part with it, and for the latter half, use the part from the second user session. This is one way of combining different user sessions. This is the second technique. The third technique is you reuse user sessions. You look at the title of this slide. Reuse user sessions, but modify the content that you send in the form. So let's go back here for a minute. Each user session consists of n requests. Each request fetches a URL and it sends a set of name value pairs, one or more, through a form, right? So you can modify the values that are filled as the part of the form to based on whatever you want. So that's what is being done. So here the main idea is store, replay or reuse the user session by modifying the input forms that alter the behavior of the web application. So same thing, start with some user session that has not been used earlier, let's say UA. Take a request Ri from UA and check if Ri has at least one or more name value pairs. That is, Ri is a request that submits some data through a form. That form has some data in it, values that correspond to certain names. Like maybe there is a value that corresponds to the field called name. There is a set of values that corresponds to age. There is a set of values that corresponds to address, things like that. So pick up one such RI. If it does not have, then you say, okay, I'll pick up some other RI. Now you have all these values. So let's say this RI has a form that has 3 different name value pairs. One for name, one for age, one for address. Now you can modify those values. These modifications that you see here, 1, 2, and so on, they are generic modifications irrespective of what the domain is. So one simple generic modification is whatever the value was, replace it with an empty string. So instead of submitting some name in the form, just submit an empty string as name, see how the server will respond. Instead of submitting some number for age in the form, just submit empty string as age, see how the server will respond. Whatever values are, replace one or more values with an empty string. Or you could delete one or more characters in that value and send some garbled string for that value and then see what happens. You could add a character to that value, send some garbled string and see what happens. So this is purely your creativity. Any amount of generic value modifications that you can do, or you could even do specific value modifications to see how the server responds. This is similar to bypass testing. We modify values, send the form and see what happens. And you repeat this process. So these are simple ways of reusing user sessions. So let me just go back. So what we learned was save a user session. Then you can directly reuse it, create replicas of it. You can replay a mixture of user session. First part from one user session and a matching second part from a second user session, such that the first user session and second user session have one common request. The third part is store user sessions, but do modifications by changing the values. That's all you're doing. And this is a simple way, but very effective way of testing web applications. Whatever I told you is from these papers. I will make them available along with the slides. Feel free to use them to read and understand more of these techniques. I'll stop here for now. We will look at one more technique for web application testing in the next lecture. Thank you.